The execution's aftermath. Dawn broke grey and cold over London Bridge on December 1st, 1326. Young Thomas the scribe pulled his cloak tighter as he approached the grotesque display that crowned the ancient stone crossing. The head of Hugh Despenser, the younger, gazed down at the Thames with eyes that seemed to follow his movement, a trick of the morning light, surely, but one that made Thomas's skin crawl. As the newest member of the Royal Scriptorium, Thomas had drawn the grim duty of recording the condition of traitors' remains. It was bureaucratic work, the kind of mundane horror that medieval administration demanded. Yet as he approached Despenser's severed head, something in those frozen features suggested a consciousness that death should have extinguished. The man whose brain once orchestrated the systematic terror of an entire kingdom now served as carrion for ravens. England had celebrated his death with a fervor typically reserved for military victories. Ale had flowed freely in taverns from London to York as news spread of the tyrant's end. But to understand why an entire nation rejoiced in one man's agony, we must journey back to where this darkness began, to the moment when a king's weakness created a monster. The making of a monster. The weakness at the heart of power. Edward II of England possessed everything a medieval king required, except the one quality that mattered most, the ability to rule without needing to be loved. This fundamental weakness, this desperate hunger for intimate connection, would prove more dangerous to his kingdom than any foreign army or natural disaster. When Edward inherited the throne in 1307, he brought with him a secret that would define his reign and doom his people. Unlike his father, the legendary Hammer of the Scots, Edward II craved not conquest, but companionship. He surrounded himself with favorites, men who offered him the emotional intimacy that his royal station otherwise denied him. In a world where kings were expected to stand alone at the apex of society, Edward's neediness created a vacuum that ambitious men learned to exploit. The first of these men was Piers Gaveston, a charismatic Gascon knight whose relationship with the king scandalized the English court. Gaveston understood that Edward's love could be more valuable than armies or gold, but he made a fatal error. He believed that being loved by a king made him untouchable. The English nobility proved him wrong in 1312, hunting him down like a rabid dog and executing him without trial. Most men would have learned from Gaveston's fate. Most men would have recognized the danger of becoming too close to a king whose affections could ignite civil war. But in the shadows of Edward's court, a more calculating mind was taking notes, studying Gaveston's mistakes with the cold precision of a predator analyzing failed prey. This dynamic, the needy ruler and the ambitious courtier, repeats itself across history like a virus seeking new hosts. In corporate boardrooms, political administrations, and family businesses, we see the same pattern: weakness at the center, creating opportunities for those willing to exploit emotional dependency. The methods change, but the fundamental mechanics of psychological manipulation remain constant across centuries. Edward's court after Gaveston's death resembled a grieving household where the patriarch's emotional needs had become everyone's primary concern. Nobles walked on eggshells, never knowing when the king's depression might manifest as royal rage. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty stepped Hugh Despenser, the younger, carrying with him lessons learned from his predecessor's spectacular failure. The student of power. Hugh Despenser was born around 1286 into a family that understood power's true nature. Unlike the romantic notion of medieval nobility as honorable warriors, the Despenser clan represented a newer breed: bureaucratic predators who wielded legal documents as skillfully as others wielded swords. Hugh's father had already established the family's reputation for ruthless efficiency in royal service, but the son would prove far more ambitious than the father had ever dared imagine. While other young nobles learned swordplay and courtly manners, Hugh studied the subtle art of dependency creation. He observed how power flowed through informal channels, how fear could be disguised as respect, and how the systematic elimination of alternatives could make even the worst relationship seem precious to its victim. Gaveston's execution served as Hugh's graduate education in political survival. He analyzed every aspect of the Gascons' downfall, with clinical detachment, the foreign birth that made Gaveston an outsider, the flamboyant behavior that offended English sensibilities, the failure to build institutional support beyond the king's affection. Each of Gaveston's mistakes became a lesson in Hugh's private curriculum of power acquisition. The key insight that would define Hugh's approach was simple yet profound. True power lay not in being loved by the king, but in making oneself indispensable to the king's ability to function. Love could fade, but dependency was permanent. While Gaveston had sought to be Edward's companion, Hugh would become Edward's prosthetic and external organ, without which the king could not survive. Hugh's initial approach to the grief-stricken Edward revealed a psychological sophistication that would have impressed modern corporate manipulators. Rather than rushing to fill Gaveston's role, he positioned himself as the king's helper in mourning the lost favorite. He became the one person who could speak Gaveston's name without judgment, who could listen to Edward's guilt and regret without offering empty comfort or unwanted advice. This patient cultivation of trust allowed Hugh to study Edward's psychological architecture like a burglar casing a house. He learned which emotional triggers produced which responses, how guilt could be weaponized, and how a king's natural authority could be redirected through carefully managed dependency. The relationship that grew between them had all the superficial qualities of friendship while concealing the calculating precision of a spider wrapping its prey. The first warning signs of Hugh's true nature appeared in small cruelties that those around him initially dismissed as youthful arrogance. Servants who displeased him found themselves dismissed without reference. Lesser nobles who failed to show proper deference discovered administrative obstacles blocking their access to royal favor. These early exercises in petty tyranny served as both psychological satisfaction and practical training for the larger horrors to come. By 1318, Hugh had achieved something Gaveston never had: institutional power independent of royal affection. His appointment as Edward's chamberlain gave him control over access to the king, allowing him to filter information and isolate Edward from competing influences. Unlike previous royal favorites who'd been content with titles and wealth, Hugh sought something far more dangerous: the ability to think for the king. The architecture of control. Hugh's transformation of English government represented a dark innovation in the exercise of power. While traditional tyranny relied on open force and intimidation, Hugh pioneered what modern analysts might recognize as administrative authoritarianism, the use of bureaucratic processes and legal procedures to create a veneer of legitimacy around systematic oppression. His first target was the legal system itself. Through a combination of judicial appointments, procedural manipulation, and selective enforcement, Hugh turned English law into an instrument of personal vengeance disguised as royal justice. Courts that had once offered some protection to the innocent became theatrical stages where predetermined outcomes were performed with elaborate ceremony. The genius of Hugh's approach lay in its incremental nature. Rather than launching a dramatic coup, he implemented changes so gradually that each new restriction seemed like a reasonable response to the previous crisis he had secretly orchestrated. Lords who might have rebelled against open tyranny found themselves trapped in a web of legal obligations that made resistance technically treasonous. Hugh's systematic approach to creating psychological dependency in Edward represented perhaps his most disturbing innovation. He began by making himself indispensable to the king's daily routine, managing Edward's schedule, controlling his correspondence, even influencing his choice of clothing. Gradually, Hugh expanded his role until Edward found himself incapable of making any decision, however minor, without his favorite's input. The relationship between the two men evolved into something that transcended normal categories of friendship, romance, or political alliance. Hugh had become Edward's external brain, the organ through which the king processed information and made decisions. This psychological fusion meant that threats to Hugh registered in Edward's mind as threats to his own cognitive function, a dependency so complete that separation would have felt like lobotomy. Meanwhile, Hugh was building a parallel power structure that operated alongside the traditional institutions of English government. His network of informants penetrated every level of society, from stable boys in noble households to clerks in monastic scriptoriums. This surveillance apparatus served multiple functions: gathering intelligence, identifying potential threats, and creating the paranoid atmosphere that made resistance seem impossible. The economic dimension of Hugh's control strategy revealed his understanding of power's material foundations. Rather than simply extracting wealth through taxation or confiscation, he created systems of debt and obligation that made potential enemies dependent on his continued favor. Lords who might have opposed him found themselves financially ruined if they lost access to royal contracts and appointments controlled by Hugh's administration. Perhaps most chilling was Hugh's innovation in the use of family bonds as instruments of control. He understood that medieval society's emphasis on kinship loyalty could be weaponized by threatening the innocent relatives of his enemies. A lord might risk his own life in rebellion, but few were willing to condemn their children to imprisonment or their wives to penury. By 1322, Hugh had achieved something unprecedented in English history, a form of totalitarian control that operated through existing institutions rather than replacing them. Edward II remained king in name and ceremony, but every significant decision flowed through Hugh's approval. The traditional nobility found themselves reduced to ceremonial roles in their own government, maintaining the appearance of power while possessing none of its substance. The point of no return came when Hugh realized that his position had become so extreme that any loss of power would mean death. Having made so many enemies and committed so many crimes under the protection of royal favor, he could never safely step down or retire to private life. This realization transformed his relationship with power from instrumental to existential. He didn't simply want to rule England. He had to rule it or die some. The reign of shadows, the machinery of terror. Hugh Despencer's England represented a new form of political organization, the bureaucratic police state. Unlike the crude tyrannies of earlier eras that relied primarily on military force, Hugh's system operated through the systematic corruption of legal and administrative processes. Every institution that should have protected the innocent was transformed into an instrument of oppression, creating a society where resistance seemed not just dangerous, but literally impossible. The Earl of Lancaster's destruction provided the template for Hugh's approach to eliminating enemies. So, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, was Edward II's cousin and one of the most powerful nobles in England, a man whose royal blood and vast estates should have made him untouchable. Hugh's campaign against Lancaster demonstrated that no one was safe from his machinery of destruction. Rather than simply ordering Lancaster's assassination, Hugh orchestrated a complex legal and political campaign designed to strip away the Earl's protections layer by layer. First came administrative harassment tax assessments that exceeded Lancaster's ability to pay, legal challenges to his land titles, and bureaucratic obstacles that prevented him from exercising his traditional rights. These measures were designed not to destroy Lancaster immediately, but to isolate him from potential allies who might fear similar treatment. When Lancaster finally rebelled in 1322, Hugh was ready with a propaganda campaign that portrayed the Earl's resistance as treason against the crown. The subsequent trial was a masterpiece of judicial theater, complete with fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and predetermined verdict. Lancaster's execution sent a message that would resonate throughout English society. Even royal blood offered no protection against Hugh's displeasure. The case of Lady Alice Deasy revealed another dimension of Hugh's systematic cruelty. Lady Alice was one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, controlling vast estates that Hugh coveted for their strategic and economic value, rather than simply seizing her property through royal decree. Hugh devised a more elegant solution that would appear legally sound while achieving his desired result. Lady Alice was essentially kidnapped under the pretense of protective custody, then held in conditions designed to break her will. Hugh's agents spread rumors about her mental instability while simultaneously pressuring her legal representatives to sign documents transferring control of her estates. The process took months, but when completed, Hugh had gained control of some of England's richest lands through what appeared to be legal transfer rather than naked theft. The torture of Bishop Adam Orleton represented Hugh's most shocking violation of medieval social boundaries. The church enjoyed theoretical immunity from secular authority, and bishops were considered God's representatives on earth. Hugh's decision to arrest and torture a bishop demonstrated his complete disregard for traditional limitations on royal power. Bishop Adam's crime was delivering a sermon that criticized royal policy in vague, theoretical terms. Under normal circumstances, such criticism would have been ignored or addressed through ecclesiastical channels. Hugh's response, kidnapping a bishop from his own cathedral and subjecting him to physical torture, sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe. If God's representatives were not safe from Hugh's reach, then no one was. These high-profile cases were merely the visible portion of Hugh's terror apparatus. Throughout England, lesser nobles, merchants, and common people faced similar treatment on a smaller scale. The key to Hugh's system was its apparent randomness as victims were chosen, not just for their opposition to his rule, but to create an atmosphere where anyone might be next. The psychology of complicity played a crucial role in Hugh's success, by involving others in his crimes through coercion or incentive. He created a network of shared guilt that made resistance psychologically difficult. Judges who issued predetermined verdicts, tax collectors who assessed impossible levies, and soldiers who carried out illegal arrests all became collaborators whose own survival depended on Hugh's continued power. Hugh understood that the most effective terror operates through anticipation rather than application, by ensuring that his most spectacular cruelties were widely known and discussed. He created a climate where self-censorship and preemptive compliance became survival strategies. People learned to modify their behavior not because they had been threatened directly, but because they understood what happened to those who attracted Hugh's attention. The Queen's Awakening. Isabella of France had been raised to understand power's complexities from childhood. As the daughter of Philip IV of France, she had witnessed firsthand how medieval politics operated beneath its chivalric surface. Yet even her sophisticated political education failed to prepare her for the systematic humiliation that Hugh Despenser would inflict upon her. Initially, Isabella misunderstood the nature of the threat Hugh posed to her position. She had observed other royal favorites throughout European courts and assumed that Hugh's influence, like theirs, would be primarily ceremonial and temporary. This miscalculation nearly cost her everything, as Hugh's campaign against her was designed not merely to marginalize her, but to eliminate her as a political factor entirely. Hugh's strategy for neutralizing Isabella revealed his psychological insight into the mechanics of royal marriage. Rather than attacking her directly, which might have provoked Edward's protective instincts, Hugh systematically undermined the practical foundations of her position. Her household budget was reduced, her staff dismissed, and her access to Edward carefully controlled. Each reduction was presented as an economic necessity or administrative efficiency, making Isabella's complaints seem petty and grasping. The systematic isolation was perhaps more damaging than any direct assault could have been. Isabella found herself cut off from the informal networks of information and influence that made royal life bearable. Friends became distant, advisors disappeared, and even her own children were gradually removed from her direct supervision. The loneliness was calculated to break her spirit and make her dependent on Hugh's occasional mercies. The moment of Isabella's awakening came not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet realization. Sitting alone in her reduced quarters, surrounded by unfamiliar servants who reported her every word to Hugh's agents, she understood that her husband's favorite intended to erase her from history entirely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: reduce her to such insignificance that her eventual death or disappearance would seem natural rather than suspicious. This realization transformed Isabella from a victim into a strategist. The trauma of systematic humiliation, rather than breaking her spirit, crystallized her understanding of power's true nature. She began to see through the elaborate courtesies and legal fictions that disguised Hugh's tyranny, recognizing them as the tools of control they truly were. Isabella's exile to France in 1325, ostensibly to negotiate with her brother King Charles IV, provided the opportunity she needed to begin organizing resistance. Distance from Hugh's immediate control allowed her to think clearly for the first time in years, while her position as Edward's queen and Charles's sister gave her unique diplomatic credentials that potential allies found attractive. The coalition Isabella assembled in France represented a cross-section of Hugh's enemies, English nobles who had fled his persecution, foreign powers concerned about his influence, and ambitious men who saw opportunity in England's political chaos. Her genius lay in presenting their various grievances as part of a single, coherent narrative about the restoration of legitimate government. Isabella's propaganda campaign against Hugh was masterful in its simplicity and emotional resonance. She portrayed herself as the wronged wife and loving mother driven from her own kingdom by her husband's unnatural attachment to an evil counselor. This narrative tapped into powerful cultural anxieties about male relationships, royal authority, and the proper order of Christian society. More importantly, Isabella understood that successful rebellion required more than just military force. It needed moral legitimacy. By positioning herself as the defender of traditional law and custom against Hugh's innovations, she gave potential supporters a way to frame their personal grievances as principled resistance to tyranny, the kingdom of fear. By 1324, Hugh Despencer's England had become something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a society where the state's primary function was surveillance, and the population's primary occupation was watching each other for signs of disloyalty. This transformation created a psychological atmosphere that modern readers might recognize from 20th century totalitarian regimes. The surveillance apparatus Hugh created extended far beyond his formal network of agents and informants. Through a combination of incentives and threats, he had transformed ordinary social relationships into instruments of political control. Servants spied on masters, children reported on parents, and neighbors informed on neighbors. The traditional bonds of feudal loyalty and family connection began to dissolve under the corrosive influence of systematic mistrust. The collaboration trap proved particularly effective in neutralizing potential resistance. Hugh understood that people who had been forced to participate in his system of oppression, even in minor ways, would be psychologically invested in its continuation. A merchant who had profited from seizing a rival's property, a clerk who had falsified records, or a judge who had issued an unjust verdict, all became stakeholders in Hugh's survival. Children occupied a special place in Hugh's system of control, serving as both hostages and intelligence sources. Noble families found their children removed from their households for education at court, where they were indoctrinated in loyalty to Hugh while serving as guarantees of their parents' good behavior. These children often internalized their captors' values, creating family divisions that persisted long after Hugh's death. The corruption of religious institutions represented one of Hugh's most psychologically damaging innovations. Medieval society depended on the church to provide moral authority and spiritual comfort independent of secular power. Hugh's systematic subordination of ecclesiastical leadership to his political needs eliminated this crucial source of alternative values and sanctuary. Priests found themselves caught between their spiritual obligations and their physical survival. Those who spoke out against Hugh's policies faced imprisonment, torture, or worse. Those who remained silent became complicit in evil. This impossible choice created a crisis of faith that affected not just individual clerics, but the entire spiritual foundation of English society. The economic dimension of Hugh's control system created a form of financial totalitarianism that made resistance economically suicidal. Through his control of royal appointments, legal decisions, and trade regulations, Hugh could financially destroy anyone who opposed him while enriching those who served his interests. This economic leverage often proved more effective than physical threats in securing compliance. Debt became one of Hugh's most powerful weapons. By manipulating interest rates, calling in loans, and creating administrative obstacles to trade, he could reduce wealthy families to poverty virtually overnight. The fear of financial ruin often motivated cooperation more effectively than the fear of physical violence, particularly among the merchant classes whose wealth existed largely on paper. The psychological toll of living under Hugh's regime manifested in various forms of social pathology that contemporary observers noted but struggled to understand. Rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide increased dramatically. Traditional festivals and celebrations became subdued affairs as people feared that excessive joy might be interpreted as political defiance. Perhaps most disturbing was the gradual normalization of extreme cruelty in everyday life. As Hugh's spectacular punishments became routine, ordinary people began to accept levels of violence and injustice that would have horrified their parents. This moral degradation created a society where the abnormal became normal, and resistance seemed not just dangerous, but psychologically unthinkable. The unraveling. Hugh Despenser's fatal flaw lay in the very perfectionism that had made his rise to power so effective. Having created a system of control so comprehensive that opposition seemed impossible, he began to believe his own propaganda about invincibility. This psychological shift from calculating predator to overconfident tyrant would prove to be his undoing. The intelligence network that had served Hugh so well during his rise began to fail him precisely when he needed it most. A surveillance system based on fear and coercion inevitably produces the kind of information that subordinates think their superiors want to hear, rather than accurate reporting. As Hugh's paranoia increased, his agents became more reluctant to deliver unwelcome news, creating an echo chamber that insulated him from reality. Isabella's return to England in September 1326 caught Hugh's regime completely unprepared. Not because they lacked warning, but because the warning they received didn't fit their preconceptions about the Queen's capabilities. Hugh had become so accustomed to thinking of Isabella as a defeated enemy that he couldn't process intelligence suggesting she had become a formidable threat. The speed of Hugh's regime's collapse revealed the fragility that had always lurked beneath its apparent strength. A system built on fear rather than loyalty crumbled the moment people believed that an alternative was possible. Lords who had spent years collaborating with Hugh's oppression suddenly discovered their moral principles when Isabella's army appeared on the horizon. The phenomenon unfolded like a psychological avalanche. Each defection made the next one easier to justify. As former supporters convinced themselves that they had always opposed Hugh privately and were simply waiting for the right moment to reveal their true loyalties. This collective rewriting of personal history allowed many of Hugh's collaborators to position themselves as victims rather than accomplices. Edward II's response to the crisis revealed the complete psychological dependency that Hugh had cultivated so carefully. Faced with military defeat and political isolation, the king seemed incapable of independent thought or action. Rather than attempting to save his throne through compromise or strategic retreat, Edward clung to Hugh with the desperation of an addict protecting his drug supply. The flight westward toward Wales represented Hugh's final miscalculation. He had assumed that regions where his power had been strongest would offer sanctuary, but he failed to understand that his support had always been based on fear rather than affection. When local leaders calculated that their future lay with Isabella rather than with a discredited king and his favorite, even Hugh's former strongholds became hostile territory. The capture near L'Entresant on November 16, 1326, marked the end of Hugh's earthly power. But his psychological influence over Edward persisted even in defeat. Contemporary accounts describe Edward begging for his favorite's life with an intensity that shocked even Isabella's supporters. The king seemed more concerned with Hugh's fate than with his own crown, revealing the complete emotional dependency that had made Hugh's tyranny possible. Hugh's alleged suicide attempt, while in custody, sparked debate among contemporary chroniclers and modern historians alike. Some saw it as proof of cowardice, others as evidence of his understanding that death was preferable to what awaited him. The truth may be more complex after years of inflicting psychological torture on others. Hugh may have been psychologically unprepared to face his own mortality and suffering. The Reckoning. The Theater of Justice. The decision to execute Hugh Despenser at Hereford rather than London was laden with symbolic significance that Isabella's supporters understood perfectly. Hereford lay in the Welsh marches where Hugh's power had been strongest and where many of his most egregious crimes had been committed. More importantly, it was the episcopal seat of Bishop Adam Orleton, whom Hugh had tortured for political opposition. The location transformed Hugh's execution from mere revenge into a restoration of moral order. Isabella's choreography of the execution revealed her sophisticated understanding of political theater and mass psychology. Every element was designed to serve multiple purposes, satisfying the desire for revenge among Hugh's victims, demonstrating the restoration of legitimate authority, and creating a spectacle memorable enough to deter future royal favorites from similar ambitions. The crowd that assembled for Hugh's execution represented a cross-section of English society, united by shared hatred for their former oppressor. Lords whose families had been destroyed, merchants who had been financially ruined, and common people who had lived in fear all gathered to witness what they considered divine justice rather than human revenge. Their presence transformed the execution from a government killing into a community celebration. The charges read against Hugh before his execution provided a comprehensive catalog of medieval political crimes, but also revealed the specific nature of his innovation in tyranny. Beyond the traditional accusations of treason and theft, the charges included the manipulation of legal processes, the corruption of royal authority, and the creation of a climate of fear that had poisoned English society at its roots. The international audience for Hugh's execution included representatives from courts throughout Europe who had watched his rise with fascination and alarm. Their reports home would influence how future royal favorites were treated and would contribute to the development of political theories about the limits of royal power and the dangers of corrupt counselors. Isabella's decision to deny Hugh a formal trial reflected both practical politics and symbolic messaging. A trial would have provided Hugh with a platform to justify his actions and implicate others in his crimes, potentially destabilizing the new regime. More importantly, the absence of trial suggested that Hugh's crimes were so obvious and egregious that formal legal proceedings would be superfluous. The reading of charges served as both legal justification and public education. Many in the crowd had experienced Hugh's oppression without fully understanding its systematic nature. The comprehensive list of his crimes helped them recognize their personal suffering as part of a larger pattern of tyranny, providing psychological closure and political legitimacy for Isabella's rebellion. The ceremony preceding the execution followed medieval protocols for the treatment of traitors, but with additions that reflected the specific nature of Hugh's crimes. The emphasis on his corruption of royal authority and his violations of natural law served to distinguish his case from ordinary treason and justify the exceptional cruelty of his punishment. Religious elements in the execution ceremony were carefully managed to support Isabella's political narrative, while Hugh was denied the comfort of last rites, reflecting his status as an enemy of the church. The proceedings included prayers for the souls of his victims and thanksgiving for divine justice. This spiritual framework helped transform state violence into sacred vengeance, the anatomy of agony. The execution of Hugh Despenser on November 24, 1326, was designed as a systematic dismantling of his identity as a man, a noble, and a human being. Each stage of the punishment carried specific symbolic meaning while ensuring maximum suffering. Medieval chroniclers, typically restrained in their descriptions of violence, wrote about Hugh's death with unusual detail, understanding they were documenting a moment when political theater reached its ultimate expression. Hugh was first stripped naked and paraded through Hereford streets, transforming the man who had once controlled England into an object of public mockery. The physical vulnerability of nakedness served multiple purposes, humiliating the former tyrant, demonstrating his reduced status, and allowing the crowd to see that he was merely flesh and blood rather than the supernatural force he had seemed during his reign of terror. The crowd's participation in this preliminary humiliation revealed the depth of psychological damage Hugh's regime had inflicted on English society. People who had been forced to grovel before his authority now threw refuse at his defenseless body and shouted obscenities about his relationship with the king. This collective expression of rage served as both revenge and therapy for a traumatized population. The actual execution began with Hugh being dragged through the streets behind a horse, his body battered against stones and debris in a deliberately prolonged process designed to weaken him physically while providing entertainment for the spectators. By the time he reached the scaffold, he was already bloodied and semi-conscious, but the main performance was yet to begin. The hanging that followed was carefully calibrated to cause maximum suffering without ending Hugh's life. Medieval executioners possessed sophisticated knowledge of how to manipulate the dying process, and they applied this expertise with professional precision. As Hugh dangled, gasping and choking, the crowd's cheers mixed with his strangled attempts to breathe, creating a cacophony that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. When Hugh was cut down, still alive, but barely conscious, the executioners proceeded to the castration that would become the most discussed aspect of his punishment. This act served as deliberate mockery of his alleged sexual relationship with Edward II while inflicting the most intimate form of humiliation possible, the removal of his genitals with a knife, followed by their burning in a fire prepared for that purpose. Symbolically severed the unnatural bond between king and favorite. The disembowelment that followed required considerable skill to ensure that Hugh remained conscious throughout the process. His abdomen was cut open, and his entrails slowly drawn out while he watched, creating a spectacle that tested the limits of both human endurance and spectator appetite for vengeance. Contemporary accounts suggest that Hugh tried to speak during this ordeal, perhaps attempting to beg for mercy or make some final confession. But his words were lost in his own screams and the crowd's celebrations. The removal of Hugh's heart and its casting into the fire carried profound symbolic meaning in medieval culture. The heart was considered the seat of emotion and loyalty, and its destruction represented the elimination of Hugh's corrupt affections and treasonous thoughts. This act transformed the execution from mere killing into a spiritual purification ritual designed to cleanse England of his contaminating influence. Throughout this ordeal, Hugh's consciousness persisted with what witnesses described as unnatural duration. Whether this was due to the executioner's skill, Hugh's physical constitution, or some combination of factors, his prolonged awareness became part of the execution's legendary status. The man who had caused so much suffering was forced to experience the full measure of medieval justice. The final stage, the quartering of Hugh's body, involved tying his limbs to horses and tearing them from his torso in a spectacular display of dismemberment. His head was then cut off and prepared for display on London Bridge, where it would join his father's as a warning to future enemies of the crown. The distribution of his body parts to various cities throughout England ensured that his destruction would be witnessed across the kingdom. The aftermath and legacy. The immediate aftermath of Hugh Despenser's execution revealed the complex psychology of a society emerging from systematic oppression. While the crowds in Hereford celebrated late into the night, treating the death as a festival rather than a somber execution, the broader English population struggled to process the sudden transformation of their political reality. Songs and poems mocking the dead favorite circulated throughout England within days of his execution, many explicitly sexual in nature and designed to further humiliate his memory. These popular compositions served multiple functions. They provided emotional release for a traumatized population, reinforced Isabella's political narrative about corrupt royal favorites, and created a collective memory that would influence English political culture for generations. Isabella moved with remarkable speed to consolidate her power and legitimize her rebellion. Within weeks of Hugh's death, King Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III, with Isabella serving as regent. The official narrative quickly transformed from rebellion against royal authority to restoration of legitimate government, with Hugh's execution presented as necessary justice rather than political revenge. The psychological impact of Hugh's death on the English nobility proved profound and lasting. The elaborate nature of his execution served as a powerful deterrent to future royal favorites who might be tempted to accumulate similar power. For generations afterward, courtiers would remember Hugh's fate when considering how far to push their influence with weak kings, fundamentally altering the dynamics between monarchs and their advisors. The financial consequences of Hugh's fall were equally dramatic and far-reaching. His vast estates, accumulated through years of legal manipulation and theft, were redistributed among Isabella's supporters, fundamentally reshaping England's power structure. Families that had been impoverished by his persecution suddenly found themselves restored to wealth and influence, while those who had collaborated with him faced ruin and exile. However, the redistribution of Hugh's wealth created new problems even as it solved old ones. Many of Isabella's supporters had joined her cause expecting rewards, and the competition for Hugh's former possessions generated conflicts that would complicate English politics for years to come. The precedent of seizing a royal favorite's estates would also influence how future political crises were resolved. The international implications of Hugh's execution resonated throughout European courts that had watched his rise with fascination and alarm. Isabella's successful rebellion became a model for other queens and nobles who faced similar threats from corrupt favorites and weak rulers. The diplomatic reports describing Hugh's death influenced political theories about royal power and the role of counselors in government. The legal precedent established by Hugh's case had lasting impact on English jurisprudence. The specific crimes attributed to him: corruption of royal authority, systematic oppression, and manipulation of legal processes became templates for prosecuting future cases of high treason. The method of his execution, combining hanging, castration, disembowelment, and quartering, became the standard punishment for traitors that would persist in English law until the 18th century. The irony of Isabella's own subsequent tyranny provided a sobering coda to Hugh's story. Within a few years of liberating England from one oppressor, Isabella had become another, using many of the same methods that had made Hugh so hated. This transformation suggested that the problem lay not just with individual corruption, but with the systemic weaknesses in medieval government that created opportunities for abuse. Modern historians continue to debate the extent of Hugh's crimes and whether his punishment was proportionate to his offenses. While few defend his actions during his years of power, many argue that the elaborate cruelty of his execution reveals as much about his enemy's capacity for vengeance as it does about his own evil. The spectacle of his death arguably brutalized English political culture and normalized extreme violence as a tool of governance. The sexual aspects of Hugh's punishment, particularly his castration, reflected medieval attitudes toward homosexuality and the perceived threat posed by unnatural relationships between men. His death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of sexual deviance corrupting political power, a theme that would recur throughout English history whenever royal favorites were suspected of intimate relationships with their monarchs. The mirror of history, as we stand in our modern world, watching the rise and fall of corporate titans, political strongmen, and media manipulators, Hugh Despenser's story offers uncomfortable insights into the enduring patterns of human behavior, the techniques he pioneered, the systematic erosion of institutional norms, the weaponization of legal processes, the creation of surveillance networks, and the corruption of information systems remain disturbingly relevant in our digital age. The fundamental dynamic that enabled Hugh's rise, a weak leader's emotional neediness, creating opportunities for ambitious subordinates, repeats itself across centuries and cultures. In boardrooms, where CEOs surround themselves with yes men, in political administrations, where loyalty trumps competence, and in family businesses, where personal relationships distort professional judgment, we see echoes of Edward II's fatal dependence on his favorites. Perhaps most disturbing is Hugh's demonstration of how quickly civilized societies can embrace barbarism when they feel sufficiently justified. The crowds that cheered his torture were not monsters, but ordinary people who had suffered under his oppression. Their enthusiasm for his agony reveals the thin line between justice and revenge, between legitimate punishment and sadistic pleasure. The speed with which Hugh's collaborators abandoned him and rewrote their own histories offers sobering lessons about moral courage and institutional loyalty. In crisis moments, how many of us would choose principle over survival? How many would resist a system that offered advancement to those willing to compromise their ethics incrementally? Hugh's story also illuminates the dangerous seduction of administrative power. Unlike the crude tyrants who rule through obvious force, Hugh wielded authority through bureaucratic manipulation and legal technicalities. This approach proved devastatingly effective because it allowed people to participate in oppression while maintaining the fiction that they were simply following proper procedures. The banality of evil that Hannah Arendt would identify in 20th century totalitarianism was already visible in 14th century England. The surveillance state that Hugh created anticipated many features of modern authoritarian regimes. His understanding that information is power, that fear can be more effective than force, and that complicity creates psychological investment in a system's survival reveals patterns that persist across technological and cultural boundaries. The methods change from informants to algorithms, from physical torture to social media manipulation, but the fundamental dynamics remain constant. Perhaps Hugh's most enduring legacy lies in his demonstration of how institutional weakness at the center of power creates opportunities for systematic abuse. Edward II's emotional neediness was not a personal failing, but a structural vulnerability that Hugh exploited with deadly efficiency. In our own time, we see similar vulnerabilities in democratic institutions weakened by polarization, corporate structures corrupted by short-term thinking, and international organizations paralyzed by competing interests. The ultimate lesson of Hugh Dispenser's horrific end may be that the capacity for both tyranny and barbarism lies dormant within all human societies, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to emerge. His rise was enabled by good people's willingness to look away from small injustices. His fall was celebrated by ordinary citizens whose thirst for vengeance temporarily overcame their moral constraints. The crowd that cheered Hugh's torture included merchants, farmers, artisans, and nobles, people who in normal circumstances would have been horrified by such cruelty. Their transformation into an enthusiastic audience for systematic torture reveals how quickly the veneer of civilization can dissolve when we convince ourselves that our victims deserve whatever we inflict upon them. In our age of social media outrage and political polarization, Hugh's story serves as a warning about the seductive power of righteous anger and the dangerous pleasure we can take in our enemy's suffering. The psychological dynamics that turned ordinary English citizens into a bloodthirsty mob operate just beneath the surface of our own supposedly civilized society. As we close this dark chapter from England's past, we must ask ourselves uncomfortable questions about our own capacity for both corruption and cruelty. In a world where power continues to concentrate in fewer hands, where surveillance technology grows ever more sophisticated, and where political norms erode with increasing frequency, the story of Hugh Despenser the Younger remains not just history, but prophecy. The young scribe Thomas, cleaning Hugh's severed head on London Bridge that gray December morning, could never have imagined that 7 centuries later, people would still be grappling with the same fundamental questions about power, justice, and human nature that Hugh's life and death embodied. The head that seemed to watch him with those frozen eyes had belonged to a man who discovered both the ultimate potential and the ultimate price of unchecked ambition. In the end, Hugh Despenser's legacy is not found in the policies he implemented or the wealth he accumulated, but in the enduring reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is far thinner than we prefer to believe. His story stands as a permanent warning about what we are all capable of becoming and what we are all capable of celebrating when we convince ourselves that the ends justify the means. The ravens that eventually claimed Hugh's remains from London Bridge carried away the flesh, but the deeper stain of his story and our fascination with it remains embedded in the human conscience. We tell his tale not because it is safely distant from our own experience, but because it is terrifyingly close to our own potential. In studying Hugh Despenser's darkness, we confront the shadows within ourselves and our society that we ignore at our own peril.